Dr. Henry Lawson stood alone by the marble tombstone, his fingers brushing the cool stone engraved with his wife's name, Grace Lawson. It had been 2 years since that fatal night, but the pain still clung to him like the damp air of the cemetery. He visited every month without fail, as if by returning to this spot he could make sense of the chaos that had ripped her away from him. Grace's death wasn't just a tragedy. It was a mystery, one that had haunted Henry since the day she died in that car crash, a crash that had never made sense to him. The police had called it an accident, but no explanation had ever satisfied him. The roads were dry, visibility was clear. How had she lost control so suddenly? Henry had gone over the police reports dozens of times, but every answer raised more questions. He dropped to his knees, eyes burning, but no tears came. The grief had hollowed him out, leaving behind a shell of the man he once was. He had been a surgeon at the height of his career, known for his precision and control, but all of that felt distant now, irrelevant in the face of this crushing loss. His hands, once steady in the operating room, trembled now, not from age, but from the relentless ache of missing her. Every month, he would speak to Grace as if she could still hear him. He didn't care if it made him seem mad. Talking to her was the only way he knew to survive. Today, his voice cracked as he whispered, "I don't know how to keep going without you." The wind rustled through the trees, but the cemetery remained silent, as it always did. A part of Henry wanted an answer, some sign that she was still with him in some way, but the silence was unbearable. He stood up, brushing dirt from his knees, feeling the weight of the world pressing on his shoulders once more. His routine was set: leave the flowers, stay for an hour, and then retreat to his empty, suffocating life. As he turned to go, he froze. A little girl sat on the grass, just a few feet away from Grace's grave. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old, her dark hair blowing gently in the wind as she traced circles in the dirt. Her presence was startling. No one else ever visited this part of the cemetery, and he was certain he had been alone when he arrived. "Hey, are you lost?" Henry asked, taking a hesitant step toward her. The girl looked up at him, her large brown eyes filled with a strange mixture of curiosity and wisdom far beyond her years. "No, I'm not lost," she said calmly, her voice soft but steady. "I come here all the time." Henry was taken aback. She didn't seem scared or confused, and there was something oddly familiar about her, but he couldn't place it. "I'm here to see my mom," she continued, pointing to a gravestone a few rows over. "She's sleeping too." Henry felt a knot tighten in his chest. He glanced over at the gravestone she pointed to and saw the name, Lily Bennett. He didn't know the name, but the way the girl spoke, it was as if she had lived with this grief her entire life. "I'm sorry," Henry said, unsure of what else to offer. The cemetery wasn't a place for children, yet here she was alone, mourning like someone far older than she seemed. The girl studied him for a moment, then said, "My mom died twice, you know?" Henry blinked, certain he hadn't heard her right. "What did you say?" "She died 2 times, the girl repeated, this time with an eerie certainty that sent a chill down Henry's spine. Once when she left, and once when they took her away. For the first time in months, Henry felt something other than grief, a sharp stab of fear. Who took her away?" The girl shrugged, her eyes drifting back to the gravestone. "Bad people. They wanted her for something. But she's safe now." Henry didn't know what to say, his heart racing. The girl's words felt like a riddle, but there was something in the way she spoke that gripped him. He had spent months chasing after shadows, trying to find meaning in Grace's death, and now this child was sitting here, speaking of strange events with unnerving calm. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The girl stood up, brushing the dirt from her dress, and smiled faintly. "My name is Sophie." Henry stood in silence, watching as Sophie turned and walked away, disappearing among the gravestones without a backward glance. His mind raced. Who was this child? What did she mean about her mother dying twice? And why did her words feel like a clue, as if they were meant for him? The questions swirled in his mind, and for the first time since Grace's death, Henry felt a spark of something new, an urgency, a pull toward answers. As he stared at the place where Sophie had vanished, He knew this visit to Grace's grave had marked a turning point. Something was shifting, and whatever it was, Henry wasn't going to ignore it. He walked back to his car, his heart pounding. The grief was still there, but now it was laced with something else. The sense that he had missed something important, something hidden in the mystery of Grace's death. Sophie's words echoed in his mind, and as he drove away from the cemetery, he couldn't shake the feeling that this little girl was connected to everything. And that meant, for the first time in months, he had to dig deeper. Henry couldn't stop thinking about Sophie. Her words echoed in his mind, filling the silence of his empty home as he sat in his living room, staring blankly at the untouched cup of coffee on the table. My mom died twice. What did she mean? And why did her innocent, unsettling statement strike such a deep chord within him? He hadn't told anyone about his strange encounter at the cemetery. Even as a rational man, trained to rely on facts and evidence, something about that little girl felt wrong. Or maybe it was right in a way he wasn't ready to understand. His instincts told him this wasn't just the random rambling of a child. Sophie knew something important. But how? And who was she? Days passed, but her face stayed with him, haunting his thoughts like the specter of his grief. He found himself returning to the cemetery more often than usual, hoping to see her again, to ask her what she meant. Each visit was the same, quiet, empty. No sign of Sophie, no answers. Just the cold, unmoving gravestones staring back at him, mocking his need for clarity. On the 5th day after meeting her, Henry stood by Grace's grave once more, his fingers brushing the edges of the stone. He looked around, scanning the rows of graves in the faint hope that Sophie might reappear. But the cemetery was quiet, save for the gentle rustling of leaves. He sighed and whispered to the wind, "Who are you, Sophie?" As if in response, a soft giggle echoed from behind him. He turned sharply, his heart leaping into his throat. There she was, Sophie, sitting cross-legged in the grass near the same gravestone where they first met. She smiled up at him, her dark eyes sparkling with a hint of mischief. "You came back," she said, her voice as calm as ever. Henry swallowed hard, trying to suppress the unease that tightened his chest. "I did. I wanted to see you again." Sophie tilted her head slightly, studying him with that same unnerving intensity. "I knew you would." "Why?" Henry asked, stepping closer, trying to make sense of this strange connection. "Why did you think I'd come back?" Sophie's gaze dropped to the ground as she began tracing patterns in the dirt with her finger. "You're looking for something, just like I was." Henry knelt down to her level, careful not to scare her off. He needed to understand. "What was it you were looking for, Sophie?" She paused, her small hand freezing in mid-draw. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than before, almost a whisper. "My mom. I was trying to find her too." Henry felt a shiver run down his spine. He knew grief all too well, but the way Sophie talked about her mother, as if there was something more to it, something deeper, darker. He could feel it in his bones, the weight of unspoken truths hanging between them. "Tell me about her," Henry urged gently, trying not to sound too desperate. "You said she died twice. What did you mean?" Sophie's eyes flicked up to meet his, her expression unreadable. "The first time was like yours. She was gone, but not really gone. Just hidden." Henry's breath caught. Hidden? By who? For the first time, a flicker of fear crossed Sophie's face. She glanced over her shoulder, as if expecting someone to be watching. "Bad people," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They came for her, and she couldn't stay. She had to go away to keep me safe." Henry's mind raced. The parallel between Sophie's story and his own was too much to ignore. Grace had been taken from him too, in a way that never fully made sense. Was Sophie's mother's disappearance connected to Grace's? The thought was absurd, yet it clung to him, refusing to let go. "And the second time?" he pressed, his voice barely steady. "What happened then?" Sophie didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stood up and took a few steps toward Grace's grave, staring at it as if seeing it for the first time. "She didn't come back," she said finally, her tone hollow. "She couldn't." Henry felt his heart sink. He didn't know what to believe anymore. Was Sophie just a grieving child who'd created a fantastical story to cope with her loss? Or was there something far more real and dangerous happening here? Is your dad with you? Henry asked carefully, trying to change the subject, if only to ground himself in something more tangible. Sophie shook her head, her back still turned to him. I never knew him. It was just me and her. Until? Her voice trailed off, but Henry didn't need her to finish. He understood that kind of loneliness all too well. A heavy silence fell between them, the kind that felt too big to break. Henry stood there, feeling the weight of everything. Grace's death, Sophie's strange words, the sense that he was standing on the edge of something he couldn't yet see. He wanted to help her, to find a way to make sense of her story, but he didn't know where to start. I'm sorry, he finally said, his voice thick with emotion. About your mom. I know what it's like to lose someone. Sophie turned to face him, her expression unreadable once again. You haven't lost her, she said simply. Not really. Henry froze, his breath catching in his throat. What do you mean? Sophie smiled faintly, her eyes filled with a wisdom far beyond her years. You'll see, she whispered, before turning and walking away, disappearing behind a row of gravestones once more. Henry stood there, rooted to the spot, his mind spinning. Her words felt like a promise, but also a warning. He had come here looking for answers, but instead, he was left with more questions. As he watched Sophie vanish into the distance, something stirred deep within him, an urgent, almost desperate need to find out the truth. About Sophie, about her mother, and about Grace. Maybe he hadn't lost Grace entirely. Maybe, just maybe, there was something he had missed, something hidden in the shadows of his grief. And now, he had no choice but to follow that thread wherever it led. Henry didn't sleep that night. The weight of Sophie's cryptic words pressed against him like a heavy blanket, suffocating any chance of rest. You haven't lost her. Not really. It echoed in his mind, twisting through his thoughts, pulling at the fragile threads of his grief. What did she mean? Could Grace still be alive? The idea was both absurd and intoxicating, a glimmer of hope where there had only been despair. By dawn, Henry was already dressed, pacing in his living room. He had to know. He had to find answers, real answers. He had spent 2 years accepting Grace's death, convinced there was nothing more to uncover. But now, the certainty of her loss felt thin, like a surface he had never dared to scratch. What if there was more beneath it? He sat down at his desk, pulling out the file of Grace's accident report that he had read too many times to count. His fingers hesitated over the familiar pages, the details of that night etched into his memory. A quiet road, no witnesses, a fatal impact against the guardrail. But as he stared at the police summary, something clicked in his mind. There was something wrong with this report. He had never noticed it before, blinded by the pain of her loss. But now, with Sophie's words whispering in the back of his mind, he saw it clearly. The timing was off. The accident had occurred in the early evening, but the report stated that the crash had happened nearly 2 hours after Grace had left their house. Yet the drive from their home to where the accident occurred should have taken no more than 20 minutes. Where had Grace been for nearly an hour and a half before she crashed? A cold shiver ran through him. He had never questioned that gap in time before, assuming it was insignificant, perhaps a detour or a stop for coffee. But now it felt like a glaring hole, a void that begged to be filled with answers he had never sought. Grabbing his keys, Henry headed out of the house. He wasn't going to let this lie any longer. If there was something about that night he had missed, he needed to find out what it was. The drive to the police station felt surreal, as if he were floating above himself, watching his actions unfold from a distance. He had been here before, many times, pleading for more information, desperate for clarity. But today felt different. Today, he wasn't just looking for closure. He was chasing the possibility that Grace's death wasn't what it seemed. When he arrived at the station, he was greeted by Officer McLean, a gruff man in his 50s who had handled Grace's case. McLean had been sympathetic back then, but firm. There had been nothing unusual about the crash, no foul play, just a tragic accident. Henry wasn't sure how he was going to approach this without sounding unhinged, but he didn't care anymore. He had to know. Dr. Lawson, McLean greeted him, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. It's been a while. How are you holding up? Henry forced a smile, though it felt thin on his lips. I'm managing, but I need to ask you something about Grace's accident. McLean's expression shifted slightly, wary. We've been through this. The case is closed, Henry. There was no indication of anything suspicious. I know, Henry said quickly, his heart pounding, but there's a gap in the timeline. I never noticed it before, but there's over an hour unaccounted for between when Grace left the house and when the accident happened. Doesn't that seem strange to you? McLean frowned, leaning back in his chair. I remember the report. We checked everything. There was no reason to think anything unusual happened. But where was she during that time? Henry pressed, his voice growing more urgent. I can't let this go. Something's not right, McLean. Please, just look into it again. There has to be something we missed. McLean sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. Look, I get it. Losing someone like that, especially with no closure, it makes you want to dig for answers that might not be there. But, Henry, sometimes there's nothing more to find. People make stops, they get delayed. It doesn't always mean something sinister. Henry's frustration bubbled to the surface. I'm not asking you to reopen the case. I just need to know where she was. Can you at least pull her phone records? That would tell us where she went before the crash. McLean hesitated, but after a long pause, he nodded slowly. Fine, I'll see what I can do. But don't expect any miracles, okay? Henry didn't care about miracles. He just needed the truth. Hours later, back at home, Henry sat at his kitchen table, staring at his phone. He had called the number McLean had provided, the one that linked directly to the cell phone company, hoping for anything. Any lead that might shed light on Grace's final movements. Finally, the call connected, and Henry's pulse quickened as the operator confirmed what he feared. Grace's phone had been turned off for exactly 47 minutes before the crash. During that time, it had pinged a cell tower nearly 10 miles from the site of the accident, 10 miles in the opposite direction of where she should have been. Henry's stomach dropped. What had she been doing out there? He scribbled down the location provided by the operator and hung up, his hands shaking. This was it, the missing piece. Grace hadn't been on her way home when she crashed. She had been somewhere else, somewhere she hadn't told him about. And whatever she had been doing in those 47 minutes might be the key to understanding everything. There was only one thing left to do. Henry grabbed his coat and headed out the door, the address burning in his mind. He didn't know what he would find out there, but he couldn't ignore this any longer. Grace's death had never made sense, and now he knew why. She had been hiding something. As he drove through the winding streets toward the location, a creeping sense of dread settled over him. This wasn't just about finding answers anymore. It was about uncovering something darker, something that might change everything he thought he knew about his wife. The road narrowed as he approached the address. His headlights illuminated a narrow, overgrown path leading into a wooded area just off the main road. This was the place. Henry parked and stepped out into the cold night air, his heart pounding in his chest. The forest was quiet, unnervingly still, as if holding its breath. He moved slowly down the path, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Then, up ahead, he saw it. A small, abandoned cabin, hidden away from the road. His breath caught in his throat. Why had Grace come here? And why hadn't he known about this place? He stepped closer, dread coiling in his stomach. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and the smell of dust and decay hit him instantly. Inside, the cabin was empty, save for a few broken chairs and a table covered in old newspapers. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. But there, in the center of the room, something glinted in the moonlight. Henry's heart stopped. A necklace. Grace's necklace. Henry's breath hitched in his throat as he knelt beside the necklace, his trembling fingers brushing against the delicate chain. It was unmistakable, the small, silver locket that Grace had worn every day since he had given it to her on their wedding anniversary. He had seen it around her neck the morning of the accident, gleaming against her pale skin as she kissed him goodbye for the last time. So why was it here, abandoned in this forgotten cabin? His mind raced, flooded with questions and an overwhelming sense of dread. Grace's necklace shouldn't be here. It had been one of the few items returned to him after her death, along with her purse and phone. The police had listed it among the belongings found at the crash site. But now it was clear they had been wrong. Or worse, someone had lied. The cabin felt oppressive, the air heavy with secrets long buried. Henry's chest tightened as he stood, gripping the necklace tightly in his fist. He had been wrong to trust the official story. There was something far more sinister at play, and now it was staring him in the face. The soft creak of wood behind him shattered the silence. Henry whipped around, his heart hammering in his chest. The cabin door, which he had left ajar, was now slightly closed, as if someone had pushed it from the outside. His flashlight darted toward the door, illuminating the dark, empty woods beyond. He waited, breath held, listening for any sound that might signal he wasn't alone. Nothing. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was the kind of stillness that comes before something terrible, the eerie quiet that makes every shadow seem alive. With every muscle tensed, Henry quickly pocketed the necklace and moved toward the door. He had no idea if someone had been watching him, but staying in this place any longer felt like a mistake. He needed to get out fast. The drive back to his house was a blur of adrenaline and panic. His mind couldn't stop spinning. Why had Grace come to that cabin? Who had she met? And more urgently, how had her necklace ended up there, undiscovered until now? As soon as he stepped into his living room, Henry collapsed onto the couch, the exhaustion of the day catching up to him all at once. He pulled the necklace from his pocket, staring at it, willing it to give him answers. But it offered nothing except the cold, hard truth that he had missed something vital all this time. That's when the thought hit him. Grace had been hiding something. Sophie's words came rushing back, her eerie calm as she had spoken of her mother being taken. Could the same thing have happened to Grace? Was her death part of something larger, something that had nothing to do with a car crash? He couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something much darker than he had anticipated. Henry couldn't do this alone anymore. Without hesitation, he grabbed his phone and dialed the number of the one person he knew he could trust. Jack Mason, a former colleague and old friend who had left surgery behind for a quieter life in private investigation. Jack was the kind of man who didn't ask unnecessary questions, and more importantly, he had the connections and skills Henry lacked. The phone rang twice before Jack's familiar voice answered, gruff but warm. "Henry? Long time, man. What's going on?" Henry exhaled, trying to steady himself. "Jack, I need your help. It's about Grace." There was a pause on the other end, the weight of the name sinking in. "Grace? Henry, it's been—" "I know how long it's been," Henry interrupted, his voice sharper than he intended. "But something's not right. I can't explain it over the phone. I found something. I need you to come over. Please." Jack didn't hesitate. "I'll be there in an hour." The moment Henry hung up, he felt a wave of relief, as if Jack's presence alone could help untangle the knot of confusion tightening around him. But that relief was short-lived. He couldn't stop thinking about the cabin, the abandoned, eerie quiet of it, the necklace lying there as if left deliberately for him to find, and the door, the way it had moved as if someone had been watching him. His skin crawled at the memory. Was it possible that whoever Grace had met that night had been watching him too? Could they have followed him back to the cabin, waiting in the shadows, watching his every move? The thought sent a chill down his spine. An hour later, as promised, Jack arrived. He looked older than Henry remembered, his once dark hair now streaked with gray, but his sharp eyes hadn't dulled. Jack wasted no time with pleasantries. He walked in, his expression serious, sensing the urgency in Henry's voice from the call. "What's going on?" Jack asked, sitting down across from Henry, his gaze steady. Henry didn't know where to start. He pulled the necklace from his pocket and placed it on the table between them. "This was Grace's," he said quietly. "I found it today." Jack frowned, picking it up. "I thought this was found at the crash site." "It was. Or at least, that's what they told me. But I found it in a cabin today, about 10 miles from where the accident happened." Jack's eyes narrowed. "A cabin?" Henry nodded, his voice growing more urgent. "There's a gap in the timeline, Jack. Grace was missing for nearly an hour before the crash. I don't know what she was doing, But she went to that cabin, and now I found her necklace there. Someone else had to be involved. I need to know who." Jack was silent for a moment, processing everything. Then he leaned forward, his voice low and serious. "Henry, this isn't just about a car accident anymore. If Grace was meeting someone, and they've been covering their tracks, then we're dealing with something dangerous." "I know," Henry whispered. Feeling the weight of those words sink in, Jack leaned back, rubbing a hand over his face. "Okay, first things first, we need to find out who owns that cabin. If Grace was meeting someone there, they might be the key to everything." Henry's heart raced. This was the first solid lead he had, the first real step toward unraveling the mystery. But it also meant delving deeper into something that could be far more sinister than he ever imagined. As Jack stood to leave, promising to start digging into the property records, Henry felt a gnawing fear rise inside him. This was only the beginning, and whatever lay ahead, it was bound to get darker. The cabin, the missing time, Sophie's strange words, it was all connected. He could feel it. But the truth, whatever it was still just out of reach, hidden in the shadows of Grace's secrets. And Henry was determined to bring it to light, no matter the cost. Henry barely slept after Jack left. The revelation of Grace's necklace being found at the cabin gnawed at him, leaving his mind restless, running through endless possibilities. As dawn broke, he knew one thing for certain. This was no longer just about finding answers. It was about surviving whatever came next. The more he uncovered, the more it felt like he was stepping into something dangerous, something that could unravel not only his past but his future as well. Sitting at his kitchen table, he waited for Jack's call. Jack had promised to dig into the property records for the cabin, but every passing minute felt like an eternity. Henry found himself staring at Grace's necklace, the metal cold in his palm. What had she been running from? Or worse, who? When Jack's name finally flashed on his phone, Henry answered immediately. "I've got something," Jack said, his tone grave. "That cabin you found? It's owned by a shell company. There's no name directly tied to it, just layers of paperwork meant to obscure the real owner. But I pulled a few strings. I think I know who's behind it." Henry's pulse quickened. "Who?" Jack hesitated. "A man named David Nolan. He's not exactly a household name, but in certain circles, he's known for operating in the shadows, dealing in illegal trades, blackmail, extortion. He keeps a low profile, but people who cross paths with him rarely come out unscathed." Henry's heart sank. "You think Grace was involved with him?" Jack's voice softened. "I don't know, Henry, but if she was meeting him that night, there's no way it was for something innocent. Nolan's not the type to get involved unless there's something valuable at stake." Henry's stomach churned at the thought. Grace had always been careful, meticulous in everything she did. She would never have willingly stepped into a situation like this unless she had no other choice. "Do you think Nolan had something to do with her death?" Henry asked, the question leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. Jack paused. "I don't want to jump to conclusions, but it's possible. If Grace was trying to protect something, or someone, she might have been forced to take drastic measures. Nolan doesn't leave loose ends. Whatever she was involved in, it's likely she knew it was dangerous." Henry's mind immediately flashed to Sophie, the strange little girl at the cemetery, her cryptic words about her mother's death. She died twice. Was Sophie the key to this? Could her mother have been another victim of Nolan's reach? "I need to know more," Henry said, his voice tightening. "If Nolan's responsible for Grace's death, I have to find out why." "I figured you'd say that," Jack replied. "But we need to be careful. Nolan's the kind of guy who won't hesitate to shut you down if he thinks you're getting too close. Let me dig deeper, see if I can connect any dots. In the meantime, you should lay low." Henry knew Jack was right, but the idea of waiting, of doing nothing, was unbearable. He couldn't shake the feeling that the clock was ticking, that if he didn't act soon, he might lose his chance to uncover the truth. After hanging up, Henry sat back, rubbing his temples. His head throbbed with the weight of it all. Grace's secret meetings, the cabin, Nolan, Sophie. Every piece of the puzzle seemed to lead him further from understanding, yet closer to danger. Unable to sit still any longer, Henry grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. He needed to clear his mind, to think. Without realizing where he was going, he found himself driving back to the cemetery. It was the last place he had seen Sophie, and a part of him hoped she would be there again, ready to offer another cryptic clue that might guide him forward. When he arrived, the cemetery was as quiet as ever, the gray sky casting long shadows over the gravestones. Henry parked and walked the familiar path to Grace's grave, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of Sophie. But she wasn't there. He stood by Grace's tombstone, feeling the familiar pang of loss. The grief was always there, lurking just beneath the surface, but now it was tangled with something else, anger. "What were you hiding?" he whispered to the stone, his voice barely audible in the cold air. As if in response, he heard a rustle behind him. He spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. There, standing near the same gravestone as before, was Sophie. She was watching him with those same unervingly calm eyes, her small frame still and silent, as if she had been waiting for him all along. "You're back," Henry said, trying to keep his voice steady. Sophie didn't respond immediately. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as if studying him. "You found something, didn't you?" Henry's skin prickled at the eerie precision of her question. He nodded, stepping closer. "I did, but I don't understand. Sophie, who are you? How do you know all of this?" Sophie's gaze flickered with something Henry couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe, or hesitation. But then she spoke, her voice as soft and steady as ever. "My mom was just like yours. She didn't tell me everything, but I knew she was trying to protect me. From him." "From Nolan?" Henry asked, his pulse quickening. Sophie nodded, her dark eyes widening slightly. "They wanted me for something. Something my mom had. I don't know what, but she told me to hide, to stay away from them. She said they'd come for me if they knew I had it." Henry felt a chill run down his spine. "What did your mom have?" Sophie looked away, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Something they need. But she's gone now, and I'm the only one left who knows." Henry knelt in front of her, trying to keep his voice calm despite the panic rising inside him. "Sophie, listen to me. You're not alone. I can help you. But I need to know, what is it they're after?" Sophie's eyes met his, and for the first time, Henry saw the fear she had been hiding. "It's in here," she said quietly, placing her hand over her chest. "Mom said it was inside me. That's why they're still looking." Henry's blood ran cold. Whatever Grace had been trying to protect, whatever Sophie's mother had died for, it wasn't just a secret. It was something much more dangerous. And now, it was clear. Sophie was in more danger than he had realized. If Nolan and his men knew what Sophie carried, they wouldn't stop until they had her. And if they had killed Grace to get to it, they would have no qualms about doing the same to Sophie. Henry stood, his heart pounding. He needed to get Sophie out of here, away from the danger that was closing in around her. But how? Who could he trust? Jack could help, but even he wouldn't be able to keep them safe from someone as powerful as Nolan. "I'll protect you," Henry promised, though the words felt hollow in the face of what he was up against. Sophie didn't respond. She just looked at him, her expression unreadable, as if she already knew the danger that lay ahead. Henry couldn't shake the cold weight that had settled in his chest. He had promised to protect Sophie, but as they left the cemetery, reality sank in. What was he supposed to do? He wasn't equipped for this kind of danger. He was a surgeon, not a man trained to deal with criminals like Nolan. The deeper he dug into Grace's past, the darker and more dangerous everything became. Sophie sat quietly in the passenger seat of Henry's car as they drove away from the cemetery, her small hands folded in her lap, her eyes staring out the window. She had grown quieter since their last conversation, and Henry could sense that she knew more than she was letting on. But whatever burden she carried, it weighed heavily on her young shoulders. As they pulled up to Henry's house, he felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. His home, once a place of warmth and comfort, now felt exposed, vulnerable to the threats closing in around him. He needed a plan, but first, he needed help. Jack. Henry picked up his phone and called his friend, pacing the kitchen while Sophie sat at the table, watching him with wide, expectant eyes. "Jack, it's me. I need you to come over," Henry said, trying to keep his voice steady. It's urgent. Jack didn't ask questions. I'm on my way. Henry hung up, feeling a slight surge of relief. Jack would know what to do. He had always been the level-headed one, the man with a plan. But even as Henry tried to focus on the practicalities, getting Sophie to safety, figuring out their next move, he couldn't ignore the gnawing sense that there was more to this story, and that the answers lay with Grace. The doorbell rang a little over an hour later, and Henry rushed to open it, expecting Jack. But instead, his heart nearly stopped at the sight before him. It was Grace. She stood there, alive, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with a mixture of relief and terror. For a moment, Henry couldn't speak, couldn't move. His mind refused to process what he was seeing. This wasn't possible. Grace was dead. He had mourned her, buried her, visited her grave for 2 agonizing years. "Henry," she whispered, her voice trembling. It was real. She was real. "Grace," he choked, his voice barely a whisper. "How?" Before he could finish, Grace pushed past him into the house, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on Sophie. Her face softened, her relief palpable. "Sophie," she breathed, rushing to the girl's side. "Thank God you're safe." Henry stood frozen, watching the scene unfold in front of him. The woman he had loved, the woman he had lost, was standing in his living room, alive. The child he had sworn to protect seemed to know her, and as Grace knelt in front of Sophie, it was as though the two were connected by a bond he couldn't yet understand. "Mom," Sophie whispered, her voice filled with emotion, throwing her arms around Grace. "I thought you were never coming back." Henry's world tilted. "Mom." He felt like the ground was slipping out from beneath him. Sophie wasn't just some strange girl tied to Grace's death. She was Grace's daughter. Which meant, "Grace," Henry said, his voice finally finding strength. "You need to explain. Right now." Grace looked up at him, her eyes filled with guilt and sorrow. "I wanted to tell you. I wanted to explain everything, but I couldn't. They were watching me." "They?" Henry asked, stepping forward, his anger beginning to surface. "Who's they? What is going on?" Grace stood, taking Sophie's hand as she faced Henry. "It's Nolan. He's after Sophie, and I had to disappear to protect her." "Disappear?" Henry repeated, incredulous. "You faked your own death, Grace. I thought you were dead. I've spent 2 years grieving you, trying to make sense of what happened. And all this time, you were hiding?" Grace's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't have a choice, Henry. They were after Sophie, after me. If I had stayed, they would have found us, and they would have taken her. I couldn't let that happen." Henry shook his head, the disbelief and anger swirling inside him. "So what? You just left? You made me believe you were gone. Left me to pick up the pieces of a life that was never real?" "It was real," Grace insisted, her voice breaking. "I loved you, Henry, but I couldn't put you in danger. I couldn't let you get caught up in this." "But I'm already caught up in it, Grace," Henry shouted, the anger he had held back for so long finally spilling over. "I've been chasing ghosts, trying to figure out what happened to you. And now you show up here with no warning, no explanation, and expect me to just understand?" Grace's face crumpled, and for a moment, Henry almost regretted his words. "Almost. I never wanted this," she said softly, her voice thick with regret. "But Nolan isn't just after me anymore. He knows about Sophie, and he'll stop at nothing to get her. I thought I could keep her safe by leaving, but now I'm out of options." Henry's anger simmered beneath the surface, but his mind shifted to the present danger. Whatever his feelings were about Grace's choices, it was clear that they were all in danger now. Sophie was at the center of this, and Nolan would do anything to get his hands on her. "We need to go," Henry said, his voice cold but determined. "We're not safe here." Grace nodded, wiping the tears from her cheeks. "I know. We need to leave the city. Nolan's reach is everywhere, but there are places where he won't find us." Henry glanced at Sophie, who was watching the two of them with wide eyes, silent but clearly absorbing every word. She was just a child, caught in a world of violence and danger that no child should ever face. "I'll pack a few things," Henry said, moving toward the hallway. "We leave tonight." As he turned to go, Grace's voice stopped him. "Henry, I'm sorry. For everything." He didn't respond. He couldn't. The betrayal, the lies. It was too much to process all at once. All that mattered now was keeping Sophie safe and finding a way out of this nightmare. As Henry grabbed a small duffel bag from the closet and began throwing essentials into it, he couldn't help but feel the crushing weight of Grace's return. He had dreamed of this moment for so long, imagined 1,000 scenarios in which Grace might still be alive, but none of them had prepared him for the bitter reality of her secrets or the looming danger they now faced. When he returned to the living room, Grace and Sophie were huddled together, Grace holding her daughter close as if she feared losing her all over again. "Let's go," Henry said quietly, and the three of them moved quickly to the door, stepping out into the night with no clear plan, only the knowledge that they had to run, and that Nolan wouldn't stop hunting them. As they drove into the darkness, Henry's mind raced with the impossible task ahead. Grace was back, but everything was different now. The woman he loved had become a stranger, and the child sitting quietly in the back seat was the key to a mystery far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. The highway stretched endlessly before them, the darkness outside pressing in on the car's windows. Henry kept his focus on the road, but his mind was spinning, tangled in a web of half-truths and unanswered questions. Grace sat in the passenger seat, her hands fidgeting nervously in her lap. Sophie was curled up in the back seat, her eyes closed, but Henry knew she wasn't asleep. The tension was too thick, the danger too close. The silence between him and Grace had grown heavier with every mile. There was so much left unsaid, but right now, there was no room for personal reckoning. Nolan was out there, and they had to stay ahead of him. "Where are we going?" Henry asked finally, his voice cutting through the quiet. Grace glanced at him, her expression uncertain. "There's a safe house outside the city. It's not much, but it'll give us some time to figure things out. Jack helped set it up a while back." Henry nodded, though the unease still gnawed at him. He trusted Jack. He had to. But the stakes felt impossibly high now. Every second they were on the road, they were vulnerable. "Henry," Grace began, her voice hesitant, "I know you're angry. I know you feel betrayed, and you have every right to be. But I didn't leave you because I wanted to. I left because I had to." Henry's grip on the steering wheel tightened, the muscles in his jaw flexing. "You didn't have to fake your death, Grace. You didn't have to let me believe you were gone." "I didn't have a choice," Grace insisted, her voice thick with emotion. "Nolan was closing in. He wanted Sophie, and if I stayed, he would have found her. I couldn't risk it. I couldn't risk you." Henry exhaled sharply, his anger flaring. "And what about me? What about the life you left behind? You didn't think I deserved to know the truth?" Grace was silent for a long moment. "I was trying to protect you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can see now that I made the wrong choice. I'm sorry, Henry." The apology hung in the air between them, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. Not with so much still unknown. As they continued down the highway, a flicker of movement caught Henry's eye in the rearview mirror. Sophie stirred in the back seat, her small body shifting as she sat up, her eyes wide and alert. "She's awake," Sophie said softly, her gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the window. Henry's stomach twisted. "Who's awake?" Sophie didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stared out the window as if searching for something or someone. Finally, she whispered, "Her." A chill ran down Henry's spine. "Sophie, what do you mean?" Sophie's eyes flickered with an intensity Henry hadn't seen before. "My mom, the one who took care of me before. She's still here. She's always been here." Henry shot a confused glance at Grace, who looked equally unsettled. "What is she talking about?" he asked. Grace swallowed hard, her face pale. "I didn't tell you everything, Henry. About Sophie." "Tell me now," Henry demanded, his voice sharp. Grace hesitated, then turned in her seat to face Sophie, her eyes filled with a kind of sorrow that made Henry's chest tighten. "Sophie isn't like other children," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "She carries something inside her, something that Nolan wants. And it's not just information." Henry's heart raced. What do you mean? Something inside her. Grace took a deep breath, her hands trembling. When Sophie was born, her biological mother, Lily, was part of a group that was working against Nolan. They discovered something about him, something dangerous, and they managed to hide it before Nolan could get to them. Lily was killed, but before she died, she transferred everything she knew into Sophie. Henry's mind spun, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. Into her? What are you saying, Grace? Lily found a way to encode the information. It's in Sophie's mind, locked away. She doesn't even know it's there, but it's the key to everything Nolan has been trying to protect. Henry's pulse pounded in his ears. This was bigger than he had imagined. Much bigger. Sophie wasn't just a child caught in the crossfire. She was the key to exposing whatever dark secrets Nolan had been hiding. And now, Nolan wanted her for it. What kind of information? Henry asked, his voice low, urgent. Evidence, Grace whispered, her eyes glistening. Proof of what Nolan's been doing. Corruption, blackmail, murder. Everything. If we can unlock it, we can take him down. But we can't let him get to her first. Henry felt the weight of it all pressing down on him. Sophie had been carrying this burden, unknowingly, all her life. And now, they were running out of time. How do we unlock it? Henry asked, though a part of him dreaded the answer. Grace shook her head. I don't know. Lily never told me how. She just said that Sophie would know when the time was right. Henry's eyes flicked to Sophie in the rearview mirror. The little girl sat quietly, staring out the window with an eerie calm that seemed far beyond her years. Whatever she was carrying inside her, it was dangerous. Dangerous enough that people had died trying to protect it. We need to get her somewhere safe, Henry said, his voice firm. Somewhere Nolan can't reach. Grace nodded. The safe house. Jack can help us from there. Henry's thoughts raced as they drove on. Nolan wouldn't stop until he had Sophie, until he could erase whatever threat she posed to his empire. And now that Henry knew the truth, he realized just how high the stakes had become. They arrived at the safe house just before dawn, the sky still dark as the first hints of morning light crept over the horizon. The cabin was tucked away in a remote corner of the woods, hidden from prying eyes, its weathered exterior blending into the landscape. Henry pulled the car to a stop, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. This place will keep us hidden for a while, Grace said softly, stepping out of the car and glancing around nervously. But we can't stay here forever. Nolan's reach is long. Henry nodded grimly. We'll figure it out. We just need time. As they hurried inside, the safe house felt cold, but it was secure. Jack had left supplies, food, blankets, a small stack of burner phones in case they needed to make contact without being traced. But even with the temporary safety, the air felt thick with the weight of what was coming. Sophie sat at the small kitchen table, her eyes still distant, her mind far away. Henry knelt beside her, his voice gentle. Sophie, I need you to listen to me. We're going to keep you safe. But I need to know, do you remember anything about what your mother left inside you? Anything that could help us? Sophie blinked, her expression unreadable. I don't know how to open it. I feel her sometimes. She talks to me when I sleep. Henry's heart skipped a beat. She talks to you? Sophie nodded slowly. She tells me to be careful. She tells me that they're coming. But she never says how to stop them. Henry exchanged a glance with Grace, his mind racing. They were closer to the truth, but it was still just out of reach. The key to everything was locked inside Sophie's mind. But how could they unlock it before Nolan found them? As the first light of dawn broke through the windows, Henry knew one thing. They couldn't run forever. Nolan would come for them, and when he did, they would have to be ready. But for now, all they could do was wait, and hope that Sophie's hidden memories would surface before it was too late. The cabin was unnervingly quiet. Dawn's first light barely pierced the thick canopy of trees surrounding the safe house, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. Inside, Henry paced restlessly, his mind racing. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on his shoulders. Sophie's hidden memories, Grace's return, and the looming threat of Nolan. Grace sat by the window, her eyes darting nervously outside, scanning for any sign that they'd been followed. Sophie was curled up on the worn couch, her small frame lost in the oversized blankets. She hadn't spoken much since they'd arrived. Henry could only imagine what was going through her mind. How could a child bear such a burden? Jack had called earlier that morning, confirming he was on his way to the safe house. He'd been digging deeper into Nolan's operation, hoping to find anything that could give them an advantage. But every minute that passed without hearing from him made Henry more anxious. They couldn't afford to waste any time. Nolan was hunting them, and it was only a matter of time before he closed in. What happens if we can't unlock the memories? Henry asked suddenly, his voice low but filled with urgency. He stopped pacing and turned to face Grace. What if Nolan finds us first? Grace's expression tightened. We won't let that happen. Henry shook his head. I'm not asking for blind hope, Grace. I'm asking for a plan. What do we do if Nolan catches up before we can figure this out? Grace's eyes flickered with worry. We have to stay ahead of him. Jack is working on a lead, and we'll do whatever it takes to keep Sophie safe. We have to. Henry knew she was right, but it wasn't enough to ease the tension gnawing at him. He sat down beside Sophie, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. Sophie, he said softly, do you remember anything else about your mother? About what she told you? Sophie's eyes fluttered open, and she looked up at him with a quiet sadness that felt far too heavy for her age. She told me to be brave. She told me that one day I'd have to make a choice, but she never said what it was. Henry's heart clenched. A choice? Did she ever tell you more? Sophie shook her head. No, she just said I'd know when the time came. A chill settled over Henry. They were running out of time, and the answers they needed seemed to be locked inside Sophie's mind, just out of reach. He wished he could do more for her, wished he could shoulder the burden himself. But this was something only Sophie could unlock, and the weight of that realization pressed down on him like a stone. The sound of tires crunching over gravel outside jolted Henry to his feet. Grace stood up quickly, her face tense as she peered through the window. It's Jack, she said, exhaling in relief. Henry rushed to the door, opening it just as Jack stepped out of the car. His face was grim, his usual calm demeanor shadowed by the gravity of the situation. You found something? Henry asked, his voice filled with urgency. Jack nodded, but there was a heaviness in his expression. Yeah, but it's worse than we thought. He walked into the cabin, glancing at Sophie before turning to Henry and Grace. Nolan's been pulling strings behind the scenes for years, hiding his tracks. But I found something. He's been working with a government insider. That's how he's been staying one step ahead of everyone. Henry's stomach dropped. A government insider? Are you saying he's got protection from the inside? Jack's face hardened. Yes, and it's why we need to move fast. Nolan knows we're getting close, and he's already put out feelers to track you down. He's pulling in favors. If he finds out about Sophie, he won't stop until he has her. Grace's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with fear. Then we have to leave. Now. Jack shook his head. Running isn't enough. We need to bring him down. If we keep hiding, he'll just keep coming, and sooner or later, he'll catch up. But how? Henry demanded. We don't even know how to access the information Sophie's carrying. There's a way, Jack said, his voice low. Lily wasn't just a random victim. She worked with a group that developed a neural encryption system, something experimental, cutting edge. It's why Nolan was so desperate to get rid of her. She was one of the only people who knew how to unlock the memories she stored in Sophie. Henry felt a surge of hope. Then we need to find someone who knows how to access it. Jack's expression darkened. That's the problem. Lily's dead, and the rest of her group scattered after she was killed. But I found one lead. There's a man, Dr. Marcus Trent. He was involved in the original project, but he went underground after Nolan started hunting them down. If we can find him, he might be able to help us unlock what's inside Sophie's mind. Where is he? Grace asked, her voice tight with fear. Jack glanced between them, his expression grim. Last I heard, he was in a secure facility upstate. But getting to him won't be easy. Nolan's got eyes everywhere, and if he catches wind of where we're headed… Henry's heart pounded. Then we don't tell anyone. We go now. We can't afford to wait. Jack nodded, but there was something unspoken in his eyes. Henry, there's something else you need to know. If we unlock the information inside Sophie, it won't just expose Nolan. It'll paint a target on her back for the rest of her life. People like Nolan don't just disappear. Even if we take him down, there will always be someone else, someone who wants what's inside her. Henry's breath caught in his throat as the weight of Jack's words sank in. Sophie was in danger, not just now, but forever. Even if they succeeded, she would never be truly safe. "We'll figure it out," Henry said firmly, though his heart ached at the thought of Sophie's future. "We have to." Jack glanced at Sophie, who was watching them quietly, her small hands clenched into fists in her lap. "She's strong," Jack said softly, "but you need to prepare yourself. This won't end the way you want it to." Henry didn't have time to process Jack's warning. They were running out of time. "Let's go," he said, his voice filled with determination. "We'll find Dr. Trent, and we'll figure out how to unlock the memories. We don't have any other choice." As they piled into the car once again, Henry's mind raced. Sophie's fate rested in their hands, and with Nolan closing in, the path ahead felt more perilous than ever. But there was no turning back now. They had to find Dr. Trent. They had to unlock the truth inside Sophie's mind. Before Nolan caught up to them, the car sped down the highway, the trees blurring past as the tension mounted. Jack drove with grim focus, while Henry sat in the back with Sophie, his heart heavy with fear and responsibility. Grace sat beside him, her hand resting on Sophie's shoulder, her face pale but resolute. As the miles rolled by, Henry couldn't help but feel the weight of the ticking clock. They were running out of time, and with every moment that passed, Nolan's reach seemed to grow longer, his grip tighter. But they had a plan now, a fragile, desperate plan that hinged on finding Dr. Trent, and as long as they had that sliver of hope, they had something to fight for. Henry glanced at Sophie, her eyes wide and watchful, and felt a surge of fierce protectiveness. No matter what it took, he would keep her safe. He would unlock the secrets that lay buried in her mind and take down the man who had torn their lives apart. Because losing wasn't an option. The tension inside the car was suffocating as they sped toward the facility where Dr. Marcus Trent was hiding. The sun was starting to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the road. Time was running out, and every minute felt like a countdown to something inevitable. Nolan wasn't far behind, and they all knew it. Jack had been driving for hours, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his face set in hard determination. Grace sat beside him, clutching Sophie's hand tightly, her knuckles white. Henry was in the back seat with Sophie, his mind racing, trying to prepare for what was coming. They had no idea what Dr. Trent would say, or if he could even help them, but it was their only chance. "We're close," Jack said quietly, breaking the heavy silence. "Another 15 minutes, maybe less." Henry nodded, though his stomach churned with anxiety. They had to make it before Nolan did. This was their only shot to unlock the secrets inside Sophie's mind, to stop Nolan once and for all. But as they drew closer to their destination, a sinking feeling crept into Henry's gut. It felt like they were running towards something much bigger than they were prepared for. "What if he can't help us?" Grace whispered, her voice trembling. Jack glanced at her but didn't answer. His silence was answer enough. If Dr. Trent couldn't help them, they had no backup plan. The weight of that realization pressed down on all of them. The facility came into view, a small, nondescript building nestled in the woods. It looked abandoned, but Jack had assured them it was heavily fortified, hidden from anyone not actively searching for it. This was where Dr. Trent had been living in secrecy, avoiding Nolan's reach. They pulled up to the gate, and Jack punched in a code on the keypad. A moment later, the gate creaked open, allowing them inside. The trees loomed tall around the facility, the isolation adding to the sense that they were stepping into something dangerous, something final. "Stay close," Jack said as they got out of the car. "We don't know who else might be watching." Henry took Sophie's hand, his heart thudding in his chest. Grace stayed close, her eyes darting nervously around them as they made their way toward the building. Jack led the way, his gun hidden but ready at his side. The door opened slowly as they approached, revealing a man in his late 50s with gray hair and sharp eyes. Dr. Marcus Trent. His face was lined with exhaustion, his shoulders hunched as though he had been running from this nightmare for too long. "Jack," Trent said, his voice gravelly. You shouldn't have come. It's too dangerous. We didn't have a choice, Jack replied. We need your help. Trent's eyes flicked to Sophie, and his expression softened with recognition. So, this is her, he said, his voice filled with a kind of quiet awe. Lily's daughter. Yes, Henry said, stepping forward. She's carrying something. Memories, information that could take down Nolan. But we don't know how to access it. You're the only one who can help. Trent's face darkened. If Nolan finds out she's here, we're all dead. He'll tear this place apart to get to her. We know, Grace said, her voice filled with urgency. That's why we need to move fast. Trent nodded, his expression grim. Come inside. We don't have much time. They followed him into the building, the interior as sparse and cold as the exterior. Trent led them to a small room in the back, where a single chair and a computer were set up in the center. It was sterile, clinical, like a makeshift lab hidden in the middle of nowhere. She doesn't know, does she? Trent asked, looking at Sophie with concern. No, Henry replied, his throat tight. She doesn't understand what's inside her. Trent sighed, rubbing his forehead. Lily was brilliant, but what she did was dangerous. She created a neural encryption system, a way to hide vast amounts of data inside the mind. It's virtually undetectable, but it requires a key to unlock it. A key? Henry asked. What kind of key? An emotional trigger, Trent explained. Something deep, personal, something that connects the conscious mind to the encrypted memories. Without it, the information stays locked, buried deep in the subconscious. Henry's heart sank. How do we find the trigger? Trent looked at Sophie, his expression softening. We need to bring her back to the moment before her mother died. That's where the key is buried. Henry's breath caught in his throat. You want to take her back to that? She's just a child. I know, Trent said, his voice filled with sorrow, but it's the only way. The memories are locked inside her, and if we don't unlock them soon, Nolan will find us. He won't stop until he has her. Grace knelt beside Sophie, tears welling in her eyes. Sophie, sweetheart, do you remember anything about that day? The last day with your mom? Sophie nodded slowly, her small hands trembling. She told me to be brave. She told me to run. Henry's heart ached. He didn't want to put Sophie through this, didn't want her to relive the trauma of losing her mother. But they had no choice. Are you ready, Sophie? Trent asked gently. Sophie looked at Henry, then at Grace, her wide eyes filled with fear but also determination. I can do it, she whispered. Trent nodded and motioned for her to sit in the chair. Henry stood beside her, holding her hand, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt helpless, watching as Trent set up the equipment, connecting wires to the computer and attaching small sensors to Sophie's temples. Grace stood on the other side, her face pale, her hands shaking. It'll be okay, Sophie, she whispered, though Henry could see the fear in her eyes. Trent turned to Henry and Grace. This will bring her back to that moment. It won't be easy for her, but we'll guide her through it. Henry's pulse raced as Trent activated the program. Sophie's eyes fluttered closed, and a faint hum filled the room as the computer began its work. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, Sophie's breathing quickened, her small body tensing in the chair. Suddenly, her eyes flew open, and she gasped, her hands squeezing Henry's so tightly it hurt. Mom, she cried, her voice filled with terror. Mom, where are you? Henry's heart shattered at the sound. I'm here, Sophie. You're safe. Just keep going. Sophie's face twisted in fear as the memories flooded back. They're coming. They're coming for me. Grace knelt beside her, tears streaming down her face. You're safe, Sophie. We're here with you. Sophie's body jerked as the memory consumed her, her voice breaking with panic. Mom said to run, but I couldn't. Suddenly, her voice stopped, her eyes going wide, her body going completely still. Sophie? Henry said, his voice filled with panic. Sophie, are you okay? For a long, terrifying moment, there was no response. Then, slowly, Sophie opened her eyes. But something had changed. Her expression was calm, her eyes clear. "I remember," she whispered. "What do you remember?" Trent asked, his voice tense. Sophie looked at him, her voice steady. "Everything. I know where the files are. I know how to stop him." Henry's breath caught. This was it. They had what they needed. But just as relief washed over him, the sound of tires screeching outside cut through the air. Jack rushed to the window, his face pale. "They found us," he said grimly. "Nolan's here." Henry's blood turned to ice. The final confrontation had arrived. The screeching tires outside sent a jolt of terror through the room. Henry's heart pounded in his chest as he grabbed Sophie's hand, pulling her from the chair. Her wide, innocent eyes were filled with fear, but there was a new determination in them, a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. She remembered. The weight of her hidden memories had surfaced, and with it, the key to everything. "Stay with me, Sophie," Henry whispered urgently, his voice trembling. He turned to Jack, who was already locking the doors, his gun drawn. Grace moved to Sophie's other side, wrapping a protective arm around her daughter as they huddled in the corner of the room. Jack's voice was low and tense. "We don't have much time. Nolan's men will be inside any minute. We need to make our move now. Do we have an escape route?" Henry asked, his voice tight with panic. Jack shook his head grimly. "Not without a fight." A deafening crash echoed through the building as the front door was kicked open. The sound of heavy boots and low voices filled the air, and Henry's blood ran cold. Nolan's men were here. The final confrontation they had feared was happening now. "We stick to the plan," Jack whispered urgently, moving to the window, peering through the thick glass. "There's a back exit. We'll use it to get Sophie out of here." Henry looked at Sophie, her small frame trembling, but her eyes, those wide, dark eyes, were locked on him with fierce determination. She wasn't just a scared child anymore. She was the key to taking down the man who had destroyed so many lives, and Henry wasn't going to let anyone touch her. "Do you remember where the files are, Sophie?" Grace asked softly, her voice trembling but urgent. Sophie nodded, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "They're in a secure server. We need to access it remotely." "How do we do that?" Henry asked, glancing between Sophie and Jack. Sophie's eyes flickered with uncertainty. "We need the encryption key. It's hidden in my memory, but there's a sequence we have to follow. Once I unlock it, I can access the files. But we need time." Jack's face darkened. "We don't have time, Sophie. Nolan's men are coming. We have to move now." Suddenly, a voice boomed from the front of the building, a cold, calculating voice that Henry recognized instantly. "Nolan," Grace whispered, her face paling. The voice called out again, echoing through the empty corridors. "Grace, Henry. Sophie, I know you're in there. You can't hide forever. Come out, and we'll make this easier. No one else has to get hurt." Henry's heart pounded as he exchanged a glance with Grace. There was no way they were handing Sophie over, not after everything they had gone through. But Nolan wasn't bluffing. He had the resources, the manpower, and the ruthlessness to see this through. "We fight," Jack whispered, his voice hard as steel. "We protect Sophie at all costs." The sound of footsteps grew closer, and Henry's pulse quickened. "Sophie," he whispered urgently, kneeling down in front of her. "Listen to me. I need you to focus. Can you unlock the files? Can you do it here?" Sophie's eyes were wide, her small hands trembling as she nodded. "I can try." "Then do it," Henry urged, his voice filled with desperation. "Do it now." Sophie moved to the corner of the room where the computer was still set up. Trent had left it ready, and now it was up to her to find the answers buried in her mind. Henry and Grace stood beside her, their hearts pounding, while Jack positioned himself near the door, ready for the inevitable confrontation. Sophie's fingers flew across the keyboard, her face a mask of concentration. Henry watched, his breath held, praying that this would work. Outside, Nolan's men were getting closer, their heavy boots echoing ominously. "I've got it," Sophie whispered, her eyes wide with excitement. "I found the encryption key." "Good girl," Henry whispered, his voice filled with relief. "Now unlock the files." Sophie typed furiously, her small hands shaking as the computer hummed to life. The screen flickered, and suddenly, a series of documents flashed across the monitor. Henry's breath caught in his throat as he realized what he was looking at. These weren't just ordinary files. They were the records of Nolan's entire operation. Everything from illegal trades to high-level corruption. Names, dates, bank accounts. It was all there. Enough to take Nolan down for good. But just as Sophie hit the final keystroke, the door burst open with a deafening crash. Nolan stood there, flanked by armed men, his cold eyes locked on Sophie. "Well," he said with a cruel smile, "look what we have here." Henry's blood boiled. He moved to shield Sophie, standing between her and Nolan. "It's over, Nolan. We have the files. Your entire operation is exposed." Nolan's smile didn't waver. "You think a few files are going to stop me, Henry? You've underestimated me. I've survived worse than this." But Henry wasn't backing down. "You won't survive this. The truth is out there now, and you can't stop it." Sophie stood up, her small body trembling, but her voice strong. "It's over, Nolan. The files are already uploaded. You can't stop them." Nolan's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing as he realized the truth. "You're lying." "I'm not," Sophie said quietly. "You're done." For a moment, the room was deathly silent. Then, in a sudden, furious burst, Nolan lunged forward, his hand reaching for Sophie. But before he could get close, Jack fired his gun, the shot echoing through the small room. Nolan fell back, clutching his shoulder in pain. His men, caught off guard, froze as Jack stepped forward, his gun aimed steadily at them. "Drop your weapons," Jack commanded, his voice cold and authoritative. Now, one by one, Nolan's men dropped their guns, the fight drained from them. Nolan, still clutching his wound, glared up at Henry with pure hatred. "You think this is over? You think you've won?" Henry knelt down, his face inches from Nolan's. "It's over. The files are out, and you're finished." Nolan's face twisted with rage, but there was nothing left for him to do. His empire was crumbling, and he knew it. Henry stood up, his heart racing. It was finally over. They had done it. Grace rushed to Sophie, pulling her into a tight embrace, tears streaming down her face. "You did it, Sophie. You saved us." Sophie clung to her mother, her small body shaking with relief. "I just wanted to make her proud," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. Henry knelt beside them, his heart swelling with pride and love. "You made all of us proud, Sophie." Jack holstered his gun, watching as Nolan was dragged out by his own men, their faces grim. "It's over," Jack said quietly. "He's going away for a long time." Henry exhaled, the weight of the past weeks finally lifting from his shoulders. The nightmare was over, and they were free. Weeks later, Henry stood in the doorway of their new home, watching as Sophie and Grace played in the yard, their laughter filling the air. For the first time in what felt like forever, the future seemed bright. The darkness that had hung over them was gone, replaced by the hope of a new beginning. Sophie had saved them all, and in doing so, she had freed herself from the burden of her past. As Henry walked toward them, he felt a surge of gratitude, not just for the family he had nearly lost, but for the strength they had found together. This was their new beginning, and they were ready to face it together.